And uh, thanks to Mike and team, as always, for helping us host and run logistics on these weekly webinars. Hi everyone, happy 2025, happy Wednesday. Thank you for tuning back into our weekly BEAD webinar series. We have made a ton of progress in the last few weeks, and so have some really important updates and details to share today, and then we'll make sure to leave time to answer your questions to make sure we're supporting you as best as we can. But really excited to be here, and let's dive in. As usual, we are here for this webinar series to provide more context and support around Connect Illinois Round 4, the BEAD program. Make sure that folks have a good understanding of how it might be the same, but also different from previous rounds of Connect Illinois. And throughout this webinar series, we'll be walking through different components of the application process, resources, templates, etc., and help clarify any questions ahead of and now almost during the subgrantee selection process. So 3 buckets for our agenda today. First, we'll do a recap of the BEAD program and progress to date. Then we'll talk about our project area units, so the building blocks for Connect Illinois Round 4 applications. We'll do a demo of the map layer that shows the PAUs as is. And then we'll do an overview of kind of the new information available about the application, and an overview of the structure of how to actually apply. And then what you can expect for next week and the following week is more of a deep dive into the specific templates that are now linked and available as part of the application guidebook. So if you're having trouble with the instructions or you want a little bit more support there, that will be in the following 2 weeks. And of course, we are always available to connect one-on-one to walk you through anything that you might need. So starting with a recap, in case we have anyone new in the room today, the topic that is driving this conversation and these webinars is the BEAD program. So BEAD program stands for the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. It's a federal program that aims to connect all unconnected households, businesses, community anchor institutions nationwide to quality and affordable broadband service. So this is a national program, and Illinois is one of 50 states plus territories working to achieve these goals. At the Illinois level, Illinois has been allocated $1.04 billion to achieve this goal. Again, that universal coverage goal. We have essentially 5 years to do this. So 1 year to finish our subgrantee selection process and submit a final proposal to NTIA, and then 4 years for grantees to implement and deploy their funded broadband service. So we are very close to kicking off that first big phase of subgrantee selection. And with that, this is where we are on our standard timeline. So you can see we are here. A couple of key updates since our last webinar. First, a reminder that if you did participate in pre-qualification, you have received a participation notice letter that summarizes everything you were pre-approved for. So have that handy, make sure you kind of feel comfortable with that, because that will directly inform the entity submission as part of your application, which we'll go into, and make your life a lot easier and save you some time. We also now have our final eligibility data approved by NTIA. It was posted online in CSV format, I think in late November, early December. And then most recently, our project area units were finalized, which are the groupings of eligible locations that applicants can use to build their applications. And now, in addition to our notice of funding opportunity, or NOFO, we now have the application guide posted. So kind of the full scale of the application is now available online, with the exception of the actual forms that you will use for submission, which will be available on January 23rd. So of course, our next step is opening up wave 1. This is just the first of up to 3 waves of applications, but we're really excited to be able to open up wave 1 on January 23rd. It'll be open for 5 weeks through February 26th. And as a reminder, there are kind of two requirements to be scored for your Wave 1 application. If you are a qualifying application, in terms of your sort of entities requirements and project requirements, we'll then look for two things. One, end-to-end fiber applications. Again, just for Wave 1, we're looking for all fiber. And then two, we're looking for applications that include at least 10% of their PAUs are hard to serve. And we'll go into all of that during the slides. And then Wave 2 kind of scratches those last two requirements. We'll accept and score applications from all reliable broadband technologies, and regardless of those hard to serve locations. So we do expect this to be our biggest wave. And then we have a remaining Wave 3 to make sure that we're filling in the gaps. This is where we might have one-on-one conversations and negotiations with providers to make sure that everything on the map is claimed at the end of the day. So this will be a 7 to 11 month process, with the first wave being 89 days, second and third wave being a little bit longer. And then all of this will wrap up into the final proposal, which we will submit to NTIA. And following their approval, we can execute grant agreements with the subgrantees. So it's a long road ahead, but starting is phase 1. So we're really excited to be really close to that starting line. So just to reiterate, in December, we published the BEAD eligible locations, project area units, and the NOFO. On January 6th, earlier this week, we published the application guidebook, which again, I'll go into later in the slides. And then Wave 1 will open on January 23rd and close on February 26th. After our webinar series ends on January 22nd, we'll have office hours at least twice per week to answer your questions. We can, create private rooms if you have a sensitive question, help you fill out the templates, talk through scenarios, whatever you might need. This slide shows a snapshot of that pre-qualification participant notice letter. So if you did participate in pre-qualification, make sure you have this letter handy, really important to help you get past some of those materials that have already been pre-qualified so you can move swiftly through that entity submission form. And this slide shows the summary of where we landed following our NTIA approval and getting to this final data set. So we have more than 175,000 locations that are eligible to be connected through BEAD. This includes 172,000 BEAD eligible broadband serviceable locations, meaning homes and businesses, plus, as funding allows, 3,356 eligible community anchor institutions. So for a total of just over 175,000 locations. And you can see on the map kind of how they're spread out here. But that PAU map, which we'll share today, will give you kind of a double click into different areas. We ran some numbers since our last webinar on where these eligible locations are located and have kind of a full count, but I thought it might be interesting for folks to see this breakdown of where are there the most eligible locations by county. So you can see here, Lee, Ogle, LaSalle, St. Clair have the highest count of eligible BSLs, broadband serviceable locations. And then you can see on the right-hand side the number of eligible community anchor institutions and the share of eligible locations and CAIs based on their share of the total portion of the state's eligible locations. So kind of interesting. And if you're looking to gather more information about these kind of stats, we're happy to share that in an email. So before we jump ahead to our sort of main section today, many folks might be aware of updated NTIA guidance around BEAD eligible locations that may actually be served due to broadband that was deployed since the challenge process last year. It's been several months, even close to a year since we first kind of gathered that initial data set. And so Illinois does plan to accept evidence if providers are able to show kind of with full confidence that a location currently deemed as BEAD eligible may already be served, and the state will then go through a sort of review and adjudication process. And there's no guarantees, but if we feel confident in that evidence and there's a time that makes sense in our process, we'll likely incorporate some of those changes. A nuance here is that those locations will still be considered BEAD eligible, but it will be on the state to have the evidence to make available to NTIA if asked, showing that, despite it being marked as eligible following our challenge process, we have evidence that gives us confidence that it is actually served and thus doesn't need to be served using BEAD funding. So we'll be accepting evidence under two categories. One is locations already served by an enforceable commitment. Maybe there was a more recent federal award or a state award, a location that we missed. We'll ask for something like a grant letter, and then the specific locations that are not currently marked as enforceable commitments in our data. And the other option is a location is already served by non-subsidized service, meaning a privately funded network. So if a provider rolled out broadband in a community this past summer, we do want to work to make sure that we're not overbuilding those locations and we can make the most of our limited BEAD dollars. So we'll be accepting submissions through a service update submission form. You can expect guidelines to be published by the end of this week, and we're planning to have an acceptance period between January 10th and February 6th. We'll likely do this a couple times over the next several months. We don't want to put additional pressure or asks on providers who are preparing their BEAD applications. So please know this is totally optional, and we will very likely have a couple of different windows to accept this information. At this point, we want to get a sense for the order of magnitude of how many changes might there be, and then kind of use this information to plan how we might update that source of truth data. It is possible we don't make any updates until the very end. So a lot of nuance here, and we want to make sure our data is, clean and tight and consistent along the way. You can see at the bottom, we'll have a little CSV template here for submissions to include the location, the reason, and then some other relevant information. And then we'll have a place to upload evidence with, for example, a speed test, a customer bill, something that shows us that there is 110% service at this location, sort of beyond any sense of doubt. So main thing to look out for is if this is on your mind, if you're familiar with this, by the end of this week, I'll be sending an email and we'll put something on our website, and happy to, again, chat one-on-one if you need additional support. Okay, so moving right along here, we will go over project area units. I shared a little bit of a recap earlier, but just to lay this out again, so Illinois subgrantee selection process will happen in 3 waves. The first wave focuses on hard-to-serve areas. So we will score applications that include at least 10% of PAUs that are notated as hard to serve. We will also score applications that are end-to-end fiber. And then we will run a deconfliction process, meaning if there are applications that overlap, the higher scoring application will get kind of priority for preliminary award, and other applications, we have a process that will go through to allow them to descope their application and resubmit within that same wave. Then wave 2, so at the start of wave 2, we will publish updated project area units, meaning removing ones or graying out ones from the map that have already been preliminarily claimed during wave 1. So wave 2 will accept applications and score applications from all reliable broadband service technologies. Again, regardless of hard to serve locations, that's really only relevant in wave 1. During wave 2, the state will also determine an extremely high cost per location threshold. And this is the threshold above which the state has the option to select non-fiber projects over fiber projects. In that case, the sort of preliminarily selected fiber project has the option to reduce their requested BEAD subsidy, or change their technology. And if they opt to not do that, the state may explore other technology options for that project, or may decide, you know what, it's worth it. This is a really challenging area to serve. We're going to stick with this preliminarily awarded fiber project. And then wave 3, looking at all remaining locations, applicants will have a final opportunity to submit proposals, and will likely have those one-on-one conversations to work with applicants to pick up surrounding PAUs that they have not yet picked up and that no one has showed interest in thus far. You may have seen that NTIA also recently published their final alternative technology guidance. So Illinois will likely consider integrating the alternative technology guidance in that wave 3, again, depending on kind of the number of PAUs that are left unclaimed and where we're at in terms of our budget. So PAUs, as a reminder, if you were on our webinars over the summer, hopefully this is review. But PAUs are clusters of eligible locations no more than 5 miles apart, and they function as the building blocks of applications. So applicants can apply for as few as one PAU and as many as all of the PAUs. You just cannot split them apart, at least in those first 2 waves. So a little bit more detail on what we mean when we're talking about PAUs. PAUs include locations that are eligible to be funded through the BEAD program. Right now, they include both unserved and underserved locations, in addition to eligible community anchor institutions. And eligible community anchor institutions are defined as CAIs without access to gigabit symmetrical service. This was kind of finalized through our initial proposal, Volume 1, which has a list of what we consider PAUs and a list of what we consider CAIs, and the definition that we use to determine CAIs, and then the final list of that, I think 3,300 or so CAIs is a product of our challenge process and our final approved data. So you can see a snapshot to the right of what a PAU actually looks like. One thing we'll kind of reiterate throughout this is that a project area unit at its core is a cluster of locations. So these locations all share a PAU ID in the data. The polygons surrounding them are a helpful visual tool to show you kind of where the different groupings are. But the true PAUs are really just those points, so those dots on the map. All right, to define a couple of other terms, first we have project area. So a project area is the set of PAUs that an applicant proposes to serve in an application. Again, an applicant can pick any number of PAUs, but they cannot split up a PAU and say that they'll serve one location in it, but not another. So essentially, the project area is, if I'm applying to serve PAUs 1, 2, and 10, the compilation of that is my project area. What it is not a guarantee that an applicant will receive funding for any or all of their proposed project area. Again, it might need to be de-scoped depending on the competition and interest for that area and how your application fares in terms of scoring. Next term is called the must include PAU. So closer to the application launch, we will have a project area selection tool where you can actually indicate which PAUs are considered must include or must have. And this means that you need this PAU as part of your project for it to be either financially viable, technically viable, or for some other reason. And this will come into play during deconfliction. So if a must include PAU within the project area of a provisionally awarded project is taken, then the applicant has the option to withdraw their application. Or you might decide that you just want to de-scope it and you actually are comfortable with keeping that application in the ring, even though that must include PAU was claimed. So it's not a requirement that you have to withdraw your application, but we do want to give you that option. Next, we have a hard to serve PAU. So as I mentioned, this comes into play only for wave 1. So And a PAU is designated as hard to serve if it meets at least one of the following criteria. It has a high share of unserved locations. It has a high share of locations with little provider interest in previous grant rounds. It's in a persistent poverty county, which is a county where 20% or more of the population is living in poverty over the last 30 years per census data. And these counties, for your reference, are Alexander, Jackson, and Pulaski. And then if it's in a high cost area, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. What it is not a comprehensive list of all PAUs that may be difficult for any given provider to serve. So I think if these locations are eligible for the BEAD program, there is some reason why they have not yet been served. So we know that likely most locations are going to be challenging. Based on data, these have been deemed even more challenging, but that's not to say that other locations aren't also hard to serve in their own right. Next, we have reference cost. So there is a reference cost assigned to each project area unit. And what this means is it's an estimate of the potential subsidy needed to deploy fiber internet to a given PAU. So it's not the estimated cost to serve it. It kind of assumes that there is some match happening in tandem with the requested subsidy. The reference cost will be used in Connect Illinois Round 4 as part of our scoring rubric to help us award points to applications. So essentially, if you're requesting more funding than your reference cost, you'll be earning fewer points. If you're requesting less funding than the reference cost, you have an opportunity to earn more points. And if you are applying for several PAUs, the only reference cost that we'll be looking at is the sum of all PAU's reference cost. So we won't know and we won't ask for the specific cost to serve each individual PAU. So in one PAU, you might request more funding. In another one, you might request less. And you can kind of be strategic in that the only thing we'll really look at from a scoring standpoint is how your requested subsidy compares to the sum of all reference costs in your application. It's based on CostQuest. CostQuest is the FCC's vendor for broadband mapping, and they do financial analysis. So the reference costs are based on CostQuest's analysis and financial modeling. It is a net present value estimate, assuming a greenfield fiber build-out. I think I covered here on what it is not. Maybe one other thing to highlight is that it's not any sort of cap on what we might subsidize for PAU, and it's also not a commitment to what we would fund for that PAU. It's simply a reference. It's a benchmark that is used as a tool for you to make estimates and as a tool in scoring. But we could go much higher, we could go much lower, depending on many factors. And then finally on this slide, we have a high cost area. So high cost areas are NTIA determined areas of the state where NTIA has determined that the cost of building broadband service is above average. Illinois has 6 high cost areas in the state, and these are based on census block groups. So it'll be 6 census block groups. So PAUs in high cost areas will be exempt from the 25 match requirement. You'll be able to see sort of an overlay for these high cost areas on the project area selection tool. In the layer available right now, you can see on a location basis whether it is a member of a high cost area. And again, this is just one kind of way to measure high cost areas. It may not be inclusive of all areas that are expensive to deploy fiber, but it is the measurement that NTIA has kind of put forth as an opportunity to seek a match waiver. So a little bit more about the project area units and where we landed and how. The initial PAUs, which were published last, I think in June, early summer, were put out for comment and input through a request for input or RFI process. Several months have clearly gone by since then, and since we got approval for this data in late November. So the data has changed slightly, and I'll walk through kind of what has changed since those initial PAUs were published. So first, the data was changed based on the outcomes of the challenge process. There were locations added to the map and removed from the map based on evidence that the state accepted. So for example, if we accepted a planned service challenge, that would mean that a location that was currently marked as BEAD eligible was removed from the map. In the flip side, if we accepted an availability challenge, it means that a location that currently was not marked as BEAD eligible was then flipped to be then marked as BEAD eligible and has been added to the map. And I might have them flipped on this slide a little bit. So I'll make sure to fix that before I share out these slides. So we maintained the original PAUs as best as we could. If there was a new location added to the set of eligible locations that was close enough to an existing PAU, we kind of absorbed it into that PAU. But in several instances, they were further or they were kind of nicely clustered themselves. And so in those cases, new PAUs were added. And you may see new PAUs with just a few locations or even just one CAI. And that is because CAIs kind of have a tendency to be a little bit further from households that might be BEAD eligible. So then the second sort of input to the PAUs that resulted in some changes was our RFI process from last June and July. So we took in all of the RFI feedback and are very grateful for folks who did participate in that and went in, reviewed all of it, and kind of made manual updates where it aligned with our program goals. So for example, we looked at where folks pointed out waterways or different topography challenges that might make it hard for the same provider to serve locations on one side of this river and another, for example. We also looked at challenges with the built environment, so Big Highway, for example. And we also took into consideration feedback where locations didn't form a logical project area. So it made sense to kind of merge this location with this PAU and keep this PAU separate. So some of these were kind of made universally through code, and other ones were individual manual tweaks. So final statistics here, we have around 7,400 PAUs, with around 25% of those being hard to serve PAUs. So plenty of a selection to include in that Wave 1 application. And then below that, we have our location level summary. So all of those 175,293 locations are represented in some way in the 7,400 PAUs. Okay, so I'm going to walk through a few steps and then I will hand it over to Shubika to do a live demo of the map. And in the meantime, I will take a look at some of the questions and we'll be sure to address those at the end of the presentation. So the project area units are now available on our Illinois broadband map as a layer. You can both view them, toggle, click, and get different information. And then you can also download that data set to use for any sort of GIS mapping and analytics purposes on your end. So first, I'll highlight a couple of things here. Once you're on the Illinois broadband map, you can kind of poke around to see different information. So you can see right now, I must have clicked on a project area unit kind of shading outside of the locations, and this will show me information about that PAU. So you can see whether it's hard to serve, what its reference cost is, and then the breakdown of unserved, underserved locations and CAIs. And again, I just want to emphasize the polygons around the dots are a visual aid to just make it a little easier to see kind of what's a part of the same PAU. The colors also help achieve that goal of knowing which locations belong to one PAU. But at the end of the day, only the points, the dots that you see on the map are eligible locations. Couple of other tips here. We suggest clicking the plus button or double clicking on the map around 5 or 6 times to zoom in to actually see the locations. And then if you want to see point-specific information, you can click on a dot and it'll light up blue, and then you'll see a pop-up like the one on the right here. you can search for a location, zip code, county address, town, city, and we'll do that in the demo in a moment. And then you can also click on the folder up top to download these locations as a shapefile, which Shabika will share with you as well. It'll pop up in another window, and then you'll want to click download all. And with that, I will hand it over to Shabika to do our live mapping demo.
Awesome. Thanks, Darren. I'm gonna start sharing my screen. And I would, as I'm doing this, just encourage folks to also start sharing a few areas of interest, maybe a county, a zip code, or any other location that they might be interested in when looking at the map. So I have two screens going on here. I'll look at the chat for any input that we get from anybody in the audience. So firstly, starting out with how you can get to the maps, there's two ways. When you're on the BEAD homepage and the Illinois Office of Broadband website, you could go to the Maps and Data webpage, which has a link to the map. Or the other way would be just going on to the subgrantee selection process homepage. And this will have like all of the subsequent information that you'll also need for the process. So going on here, and then you'll see PAUs are available, and we have a link to the broadband map. So this takes you directly to the map here, starting off with accepting the disclaimer. Today, just focusing on the PAUs. So what we would recommend is if this is the layer that you're interested in looking at, then as soon as you get to the map, the best idea would be to turn off all of the other layers, because otherwise when you zoom in and zoom out, you might end up seeing other things that might confuse you. So I'm turning all of those except for the PAUs here. So turning all of those, and we're seeing those disappear from the map. This basically has three sub layers in here: eligible locations, PAU aggregate areas, and shared hexagons. So as we zoom in with examples, we'll look at some of these. So again, just calling out if there's a specific county, zip code, or a town you'd be interested in. I'm seeing a zip code from Craig. Thank you. So I'm going to type this in. I see a PAU ID in the chat as well. Just want to note that we cannot be searching based on PAU IDs right now. So it would have to be some kind of a geographic address so that we can do the search. So we click on the search button here, type in the zip code. It's in Marshall, Illinois. So when we do that, it zooms in to that specific location. So this is where we're at. Now, a few things happening here, and you can also see legend for all of these. On here, it might be a little difficult to actually see those, but the gray polygons that we see, that's essentially the PAU aggregate areas. And then we have some hexagons that are also shaded. So those are the shared hexagons. So this is a good example to look at some of that. As we zoom in, so these are all of the locations that have been determined as eligible for BEAD funding after the challenge process results were incorporated. And then we also have CAIs. So we have different symbols depending on the category of CAI that they fall into. These locations have been color coded based on the PAU ID. So for this example now, I'm going to just select one of these PAUs. So as Devin had mentioned previously and we'd seen it in the slides, so when you click on one of these polygon areas, which is the PAU aggregate area, you will be able to see the PAU ID, the hard to serve status. So this was a question that came up in the chat as well. This is where you'll be able to see whether or not it has been categorized as hard to serve. So this one is. We have the reference cost. Again, this is the cost for all of the locations within that PAU and not just one location. So this is for the entire PAU. And then we have a division or classification of how many of these locations are unserved, underserved, and how many CAIs fall within this. So now I think the color coding would be helpful here because we have a few shared hexagons, meaning some of these here, and let me zoom in a little bit more so that it's visible. We have a few locations here that are in red, so they'd be part of one PAU, and then the green ones would be part of the other one. So clicking on this is the bigger PAU. Again, the hard reserve status, reference cost, and all of that. Let's click at some of the differently colored ones so that we see what that means. So the green one, when you click on a location, you'll be able to see the address of the location ID, the PAU ID that it falls in. So this is in the bigger one that was highlighted, ending in _0. It is again hard to serve, and then we have other information. Okay. Yeah, so what's really happening here is we're able to see the extent of the two PAUs. So let me just zoom out a little bit so that we see the entire PAU. So this is the one that's ending in _0. And then we have the other one. Should have showed up. Okay, yeah, the previous one. Yeah, and so some of the red locations here, so this is a relatively smaller PAU, but the red ones are the ones that only fall in the _1 PAU. Now clicking on one of the red ones so that we can validate that. So yeah, we see the address information and we see that these are part of the PAU ending in _1. So that is what the shared hexagons mean. Again, just want to reiterate what Devin had shared. These hexes are just a visual aid. Otherwise, the polygons that we would have around these clusters of eligible locations would just be like weirdly shaped. So in order to avoid that, just using the hexagons as a base layer. And so there might be instances where you're seeing that some of the hexes are shared between two PAUs. And on the selection tool, you'll basically have the option to make sure you select the PAU that you're actually interested in. So maybe it's just the smaller one with the _1 that you're interested to apply for. So there's going to be the option to make sure that you're selecting the actual PAU that you're interested in. And you would not have to cover both just because these hexes are part of both of these PAUs. And if you select the one that is the smaller one, you would just be required to serve the locations in red. So that is one example. We were able to search by a zip code. I'm gonna look at the chat for, okay, I'm seeing Stevenson County. So we can also do one quick one using a county name. So just go in here and type in the name of the
And then
county.
Shubika, maybe we could also unselect the PAU aggregate areas to show folks how to see just the locations.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's a good idea as well. So here we are in Stevenson County. So again, it's a little at the county level, a little bit zoomed out. So it's only the aggregate areas that we're able to see and the shared hexagons. As we zoom in a little bit more, we'll be able to see the locations. And if the aggregate areas might be confusing, as Devin mentioned, you can also turn off the aggregate areas. And now you would just see the eligible locations color coded by the PAU ID. So yeah, this would roughly give you a sense of the areas where you might have eligible locations. Again, there might be I would always encourage using the aggregate areas with the eligible locations because there might be more locations in these areas, but it's only the ones that, light up here in different colors that are actually eligible for BEAD funding. So just make sure that you're using both of these together. And the most important one would ideally be the eligible locations layer. And again, similarly here, you could look at clicking on the polygon would give you all of this information about the PAU, and clicking on a location would give you the location specific information. and you could toggle between the location and the PAU to get just some additional information. Um, just looking at the chat to see if we have any other suggestions here. I think that pretty much covers it, unless we have time for another example, Devin, or we can just move on.
Yeah, let's flip back to the slides and then we might come back to this for questions.
Sure. And one last thing, so as Devin had mentioned, if you are looking to like bring this into your own software and look at the eligible locations and areas and things, here's the downloads widget here, and we have the PAU area and eligible locations data. When you click on it, it takes you to another link where you're able to download the zip file. And once you do that, you'll need a mapping software to bring all of this in. But that is where you're going to find that download information. And I'm going to stop sharing.
Great.
Back to Devin.
All right. Thank you, Shabika. I'll flip back to these slides, try to answer some questions, but we will go through all of them verbally after the slides. So we'll make sure that we get to those. Okay, hopefully folks can see my slides again. We'll keep rolling along. All right. So like I have alluded to, we will be launching a project area selection tool as part of the application, and we'll have a training on January 22nd, but it will look similar to the map that you see now, but you'll be able to actually select PAUs, mark them as must include or must have with a star, and then put them into your shopping cart and download that to upload it as part of your application. So I think it's good for now to start like getting a sense and planning for what you want to include in your application. And then you'll be able to go into this tool to actually create that final package of a data set. Okay, so just a few updates on what is available now with regard to the application. So on Monday, we published an application guidebook, which you can consider, maybe I'll take a step back. The Notice of Funding Opportunity, or NOFO, that was published earlier in the late fall is the sort of most consolidated formal program rules. It's sort of the formal a state opportunity to apply for this public funding. The idea behind the application guidebook is that it gives more context into the how. So what is the program? What's the background? What's the story? It includes all of the application questions along with the expectations for each question, whether it's a yes or no question, whether you should, provide a narrative, upload a template, and then instructions and links for actually completing the application. So it's online. This is a couple of screenshots from it. The table of contents is a helpful guide, and then you can see just a snapshot of one page. This is from the entity form on managerial capabilities. So showing, just for example here, we'll look for resumes from your team, org charts, and an explanation of how your organization is managerial ready to implement a program like this. So if you participated in pre-qual, this should all be reviewed to you, and maybe you've already done this, but for anyone new, we'll expect, things like this to demonstrate your qualifications for the BEAD program. And then the NOFO's been out for a while, so that is up and available. It'll be formally live on January 23rd, but it is available now. We don't expect it to change at all. So feel free to download and refer to that. Also on our website. Okay, so if you have perused the application guidebook, you may have seen kind of the three components of our application. So there are 3 steps to applying for the BEAD program. The first is the entity submission form. Applicants only need to complete this form one time and then they're done. So I recommend that if you did not participate in pre-qualification, take a close look now at the entity submission form part of the application guidebook, and you can kind of consolidate, create a folder on your computer with everything that you'll need to submit. It's a couple of forms, it's some certifications, and it's information essentially demonstrating how your organization is prepared to carry out this grant program. So you will submit that just once per entity. We'll review it. We may come back with some curing, but hopefully it is good to go and you don't need to think about it again. All you need to do is save your entity submission form ID, and then you'll use that for each project that you submit. Part two, we have a project submission form. So you'll submit the project submission form for as many projects that you want us to score. This form will be linked to your entity using that ID that you're given. And it'll ask for information like your budget, your network designs, anything specifically related to that project, not to your entity. So if you're applying for 10 different projects, you can submit 10 different project submission forms. Each one will be scored. Each one will participate in deconfliction. You also have the option to submit like one big application. That is really up to you based on, how you're strategizing around the scoring rubric. Once you submit your project submission form, you'll get a project ID, and then there's one final form where you essentially just submit your name, your organization, your entity ID, and your project ID. Hit submit. This is something we have to do for the state of Illinois to kind of formally document it. So we'll send out some reminders, before the window closes to make sure that you do that final step. So what does the application actually look like? This is not live yet, so I thought it would be helpful to just show you kind of what to expect. Again, if you participated in pre-qualification, it's the same platform, so it'll look very, very similar. We use a platform called Airtable. It's essentially a form that is dynamic, but then on the back end, we can sort of review, make assignments, make comments. And so it's a little bit easier than your standard form that you may have submitted through previous rounds of Connect Illinois. So you can see here, we have a little description at the top. We'll ask for information. Some fields are just like an open typing field. Some you'll select. The form is dynamic and responsive. So if you select consortium, for example, you'll get specific questions to consortium applicants. If you don't select that, you won't see those questions. And then you can see here, there are places to drag and upload files. And if there are any file specifications, we will indicate those in the question. If there's a template, we'll link to it. That's also in the guidebook. Important note that you can't save and come back to this. So highly recommend that you just kind of keep your application in a folder on your computer. And then once everything is ready, just upload it all at once, similar to previous Connect Illinois rounds. Project form is a little bit longer, but essentially looks the same. There's a lot of certifications, which are just yes or no questions. Do you certify that you have the managerial expertise to carry out this project? Do you certify that you have enough funding available to meet the match that you're putting forth? The expectation is that all of these questions will be answered yes. And if you do have any concerns, we'll be happy to chat through them. Similarly with the project form, we have uploads, yes or no's, project narratives, etc. And then the final form is if you've done anything with the state, this is kind of our DCEO standard form, very simple. You just put in those two IDs and hit submit. And closing out here, just to summarize the resources on our website, we have the NOFO, the guidebook. We have our webpage with all the resources, past webinars, our map. So we'll be sure to send this out over email and throw it in the chat as well. And before I get to questions, this is a weekly webinar series going at least for the following 2 weeks after today. Next week, we'll walk through the first set of templates. We'll do some demos, ask questions. The following week, we'll finish up with the remaining templates as well as do a training on that project area selection tool. And then we will launch and have lots of support and office hours as we go. So with that, I will look at the questions. I'm seeing lost sound. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, you're fine.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to scroll back up to the top here and just kind of verbalize some of these questions that we responded to over the chat. So is there a way to tell on the broadband map which PAUs are considered hard to serve? As Shubika shared, you can click on a PAU and a box pops up that has different characteristics about it, including whether or not it is hard to serve. I jotted down that we'll see if we can add a layer so you can kind of toggle on and off hard to serve PAUs if that will make it easier for you. On the project area selection tool, they will be a different color so you can see them a little bit more clearly visually. And then I believe if you download the data and you're doing some analysis on your own end independently, there are all of those indicators for hard to serve, reference costs, etc. Can a PAU include locations that are considered served? So the definition of a PAU is a cluster of eligible locations, meaning just unserved, underserved, and an eligible CAI. However, according to the BEAD rules, applicants can include up to 20% of their proposed locations can be not BEAD eligible, for example, served. So we will accept those, but just for purposes of the map rendering in a way that is usable, we don't have them on our current map. I believe they will be on the PAU selection tool as a layer that you can view. But if you are going to include them, we'll just ask that you pull them in separately. We'll have kind of a separate upload for that. So you'll need access to the FCC fabric to grab those location IDs. What happens if a PAU is already served by fiber? So again, just a reminder, when we're talking about a PAU, we're really talking about a series of locations that are currently marked as eligible for the BEAD program. It's possible that that there was a successful challenge against a location that challenged its speed or availability, and thus it is BEAD eligible. It's also possible that a broadband fiber deployment happened in September, and so that was sort of way beyond when we submitted our final data set. That is the opportunity I talked about in the beginning of the call, where we will accept evidence from providers showing that a location is currently served. It will be pretty rigorous evidence that'll be required because we will, as a state, need to have full confidence that this location currently has access to reliable broadband service because we would be kind of like taking them out of the mix to be funded through the BEAD program. So I'll share out the slides so you can see the details on that earlier slide. And then by this Friday, we'll be publishing instructions for submitting evidence if you have any of those instances. Okay. The PAU names don't have any significance. It was just kind of how we organized them on the back end based on when they were added. So apologies if that is a little funky looking, but you can ignore it. Doesn't mean anything. Is there aggregated data of eligible locations per county? I can share this out via email. So if you are interested in hearing that and receiving that, email broadband@illinois.gov and we'll shoot that your way. What quantifies whether an application is including 10% hard to serve PAUs? Is it based on PAUs or the number of locations within each PAU? So it's based on PAUs. If you're proposing to serve 10 and one is hard to serve, then you meet the 10% threshold. The colored dots on the PAUs, so to make it easier visually to see which locations belong to the same PAU, we color coded those dots to their PAU. So if they share a PAU ID, the dots will be the same color, with the caveat that there's not 7,000 colors out there. And so just kind of compare colors in the same region. If there's a red cluster here and then all the way over on the north side of the state, it's likely that there are two different PAUs, more just for visual aid. Got a question about if an area is private property and the private property decides that it does not want to be served. like campgrounds. If it is showing up as an eligible location, we are obligated to serve it through the BEAD program. And so we would likely work with that property owner to access the land that was needed to run service, noting that the BEAD program makes the service available. It doesn't necessarily require that location to subscribe. Of course, the goal is that everyone does subscribe, but we'll have to kind of address any challenges like that as they come down the road once we're in implementation. The opening for wave one. So the wave one window is January 23rd to February 26th. The January 10th through February 6th dates are completely separate, totally optional. If you're a provider who believes that you've deployed service to locations that are currently considered BEAD eligible, i.e., you deployed fiber last month, so we don't want to overbuild those locations. We'll have a window where we can accept evidence from you, such as speed tests, customer bills. We'll share more details on that during that window, and we may have kind of multiple waves that we accept that information. Okay. Is there still time to submit a pre-qualification notice letter? So the pre-qualification period did close over the summer, but it was not required. So if you did not participate, not to worry. You just might have a little bit more work to do at this point, but we've got time. You can start now, and we're happy to answer any questions. And to clarify, the letter is something that you would have gotten from the Office of Broadband that summarizes the qualifications that were approved during that period. Okay, to clarify, Illinois will provide funding for 20% of served locations. Yes, this is part of the NTIA's rules for the BEAD program. So if your application includes 20%, if 20% of your proposed locations are served, are not BEAD eligible, that is allowable in the application. I will maybe just offer a tip or recommend you still want to be financially competitive. So, if serving those additional, let's say 50 locations increased your ask for a BEAD subsidy threefold, then your application might not be as competitive from a scoring standpoint against someone who is not. However, if you might throw in another couple $1,000s in a BEAD ask to serve those locations and it's helpful for your business model or you're automatically passing them, then you could definitely kind of have it both ways of including those locations in your request, and also still being competitive with your BEAD subsidy ask. What does the reference cost mean in the PAU description box? So I suggest looking back at the slides when I send them out for kind of the formal description, but in summary, every PAU has a reference cost. This is based on CostQuest's cost model of the net present value, assuming a greenfield fiber build out. Essentially, it's the estimated cost of subsidy needed to serve the locations in that project area unit. And it comes into play on our scoring criteria. So if you are asking for more than that, you might earn fewer points. If you are asking for less, you can earn more points. And if you are applying for several PAUs, the only reference cost that we'll be evaluating you against is the sum of all reference costs in your project area. So we're not going to be grading you against every single PAU, just your overall budget ask. So you could, maybe take up some higher, more expensive to serve PAUs, some lesser expensive, and kind of balance out your budget in that way. What happens if a provider ends up connecting a location at some point that is considered served using the funded network, but did not include that location in their application as part of the 20% served? I might need to read that one again. Give me a moment. Okay, so I would say like to define what does it mean to include something in your application, it means that you will be responsible for reporting back to the state and thus will be reporting to NTIA on the progress of connecting those locations. And then that location is subject to the BEAD requirements. So the certain speed and latency requirements, technology requirements, reporting, affordable plan option. And so if you are, operating a BEAD project in a certain area and you decide on your own you would like to expand to X number of households that may already be served, that is completely fine. We wouldn't expect you to report back to us if you're not using BEAD funds. And so when your application is approved and awarded, you'll have a grant agreement with all of those locations, and that's the only thing that we would look to you to report back to us on. I hope that makes sense. Is there still a $10 million cap on each application submitted? No, there is no cap. Are ISPs being provided local contact information by the state to facilitate collaboration and communication? If a ISP has reached out to us asking for contacts in a certain area of the state, we will provide them or help make those connections. If you are a county who's looking to proactively connect with providers, I suggest looking at the FCC broadband map to get a general sense for who is operating in your area, because it's likely that they will try and pick up the eligible locations through the BEAD program, and we're happy to help provide contacts. And shoot me an email if you want more details than that. What happens if an anchor institution is served, but they choose not to take service and is now showing underserved or not served? So the definition of whether a community anchor institution is served or not served is not based on their subscription. It's not based on whether they choose to adopt the service. It's only based on whether gigabit symmetrical service is available to them, meaning that they could subscribe if they want to. And the way that we looked at it from a sort of mapping and geospatial standpoint is, are they within some distance from fiber? Is it possible to add a map layer of the high cost census tracts? We can look into that, but that will be a layer on the project area selection tool. But we'll look into that as
And
well.
Devin, it's census block
Yes.
groups, not census tracts that are high cost.
Yes, great clarification. Census block groups. When can we start supplying evidence of already served customers showing as BEAD eligible? January 10th, Friday. Okay, I think I got through all the questions. But for those who are still on, it's really, really important that you have filled out our intake form. So we have a couple of ways of getting in touch with folks. We have our LinkedIn page, we have our newsletter, but for the most time sensitive critical updates, what I typically do is send an email to all entities registered as internet service providers, infrastructure on our intake form. So I just want to make sure, I'm going to put this in the chat. This is really the best way to make sure that you have all the resources and that you get the information that you need live. So I'm going to put this in the chat. And while we're at it, I would say our newsletter is the sort of second best opportunity to get up-to-date information, which comes out every 2 weeks. I'm just going to find that here. And then finally, we will answer your questions at any time. We will schedule a conversation. We're pretty quick on email. So don't, flounder for too long if something is confusing you. broadband@illinois.gov. We would love to chat directly with you, and we're here to help, and we're here to take your feedback as well. We have 3 waves to get it right. So if it's something is rocky in wave 1, we will look for your feedback to see how we can improve it in wave 2, and so on and so forth. So thanks everyone for listening. I know we ran a little bit over, but Happy New Year, and looking forward to working with everyone. Exciting year.
Evan, thanks so much. Thanks everybody for being here today. We'll look forward to seeing you again in a week's time and have a great rest of your week.
Bye. Thanks.